Chapter 25. He's Alive. On a late October day in 1944, Louis pushed a wheelbarrow into Tokyo, joining a guard to pick up rations. It was the first time he'd passed, unblindfolded, into the society that held him captive. Tokyo was bled dry. The war had caused massive food shortages, and markets were shuttered. Civilians were slipshod and dirty. Children were digging trenches. The Americans were coming, and the city was holding its breath. On a wall, Louis saw a scrawl of graffiti. B Niju Ku. Louis knew Niju meant 20 and Ku meant 9. He walked back to Amori, wondering what B-29 meant and why someone would write it on the wall. On November 1st, a wondrous new American plane lifted off a Sapien runway. A gigantic craft cut across the sky at more than 350 miles an hour and carried drumloads over distances no other bomber could transverse. It was the B-29 Super Fortress. It would bring down Japan. All morning the plane flew, splitting the air nearly 6 miles up. Above was a sky of intense blue. Below came Tokyo. B-29s had been used a few times, launching from a remote area in China that had not been occupied by Japan, the difficulty of flying from Japanese bases. The raids failed, but the swift, huge planes terrified the Japanese, inspiring the graffiti Louis saw. Weeks after the first China-based raid, Americans captured the island of Saipan, only 1,450 miles from Tokyo. The B-24 couldn't make it from Saipan to Tokyo and back, but the B-29 could. The November 1st flight was the first run. The plane carried not bombs, but cameras. It was mapping the path of B-29s that would follow. Louis was outside when sirens sounded. Sirens were routine now, so they caused no concern. The guards shooed the POWs into the barracks. Outside, something was different. The guards were gaping at the sky as if, wrote Bob Martindale, they were looking for the Messiah. Then there was a glint above, a finger pointing urgently. The POWs bolting for the door. Running out, Louis saw a sliver of light over Tokyo, contrails curling behind it, like twisting spines. "Oh God, God, an American plane," someone shouted. In Tokyo, civilians stood in the streets, carrying over the water. Louis had never seen a plane like this. Then prisoners said it was an American bomber called a B-29. A cheer rang out. B-29. It was the most beautiful thing Louis had ever seen. POWs ran and cheered. Louis glanced to the camp. The bird was standing motionless and expressionless, watching the plane. It was not their Messiah, Martindale wrote, but ours. The B-29 flew at perfect liberty. The guards pursued the elated POWs, trying to force things. The men shushed each other, fearing they'd be beaten for celebrating. The clamor quieted. Louis watched the bomber, occasionally darting between barracks to avoid the guards. The plane crisscrossed overhead for more than an hour, then flew off. The bomber simply passed over Tokyo, but every morning at roll call, the 29th man sang out, "Nijuku," top of his lungs. Not even bayonet prods, wrote Wade, could wipe the smiles from the POWs' faces now. The bird wasn't smiling. It was an ordinary day. Louis was in his barracks, sitting with friends. Suddenly, 2 guards crashed in, screaming, "Kiri!" Louis leapt up with the other men, and bounded with the bird. Looking around, the bird spotted Louis and charged at him. He wore the belt he'd worn on Louis's first day in Amori. The buckle was several inches square, made of heavy brass. To attention last. The bird jerked his belt off, grasping the end with both hands. He swung it back, then whipped it forward like a baseball bat, straight into Louis's temple. Louis felt as if he'd been shot in the head. His legs seemed to liquefy, and he collapsed. The room spun. When he gathered his wits, he was on the floor bleeding. The bird was crouched over him, making a motherly sound, a "aw." He pulled a fold of toilet paper from his pocket and pressed it into Louis's hand. Louis held it to his temple. "Oh, it stopped, eh?" the bird said, his soft voice. Louis pulled himself upright. The bird waited for him to steady himself. The corporal seemed compassionate and regretful, and Louis felt grateful. The relief was The relief was just entering his mind when the buckle, whirling around from the bird's swinging arms, struck his head again. Louis felt pain bursting through his skull, his body going liquid again. He smacked into the floor. For weeks, Louis was deaf in the ear. The bird beat him daily. Louis bore it with clenched fists, eyes blazing, but the assaults were wearing him down. The corporal began lording over his dreams, his features alight in vicious rapture. Louis spent hours in prayer, begging God to save him, and lost himself in fantasies of running in the Olympics. He thought of home, tormented by the thoughts of what his disappearance must have done to his mother. One day in mid November, two Japanese civilians found Louis in his barracks. Friendly and respectful, they said they were producers from Radio Tokyo. They handed Louis a piece of paper. It was a transcript of an American radio broadcast announcing his death. The news that Louis had been declared dead, privately delivered to his family in June, had become public that week. The producers said they were distressed that Louis' family had been told he was dead. They invited him to write a message to his family and read it on a program called Postman Calls. Louis didn't trust them. Postman Calls was a propaganda show performed in English and broadcast to Allied troops to demoralize them. The broadcasters were POWs known as propaganda prisoners, usually working under threat of execution or beating. Wary of being made into a propaganda prisoner, Louis wouldn't commit. The producers told him to think about it. Louis asked Martindale what to do. Martindale said as long as Louis wrote his own message, there was no harm in accepting. Louis set to work. Knowing his family might not believe it was he added details he hoped would convince them. To ensure his message aired, he decided to speak positively about his captors. He was driven to Radio Tokyo. The producers gave his message a hearty approval. It would be taped for later broadcast. The Japanese planned to use that day's broadcast to tease the audience, then wait 2 days before airing his voice, proof they were telling the truth. Louis taped his message, then returned to Amori. In San Francisco at 2:30 a.m. on November 18th, a young woman named Lynn Moody was working the graveyard shift in the Office of War Information. A colleague was listening to Japanese broadcasts and typing them up for review by propaganda analysts. The colleague asked Moody to fill in during her break. Moody slipped on the earphones. She was startled to hear a name she knew, Louis Zamperini. Moody was a USC graduate and Louis was an old friend. Moody began typing. Recently, a news report stated that First Lieutenant Louis Zamperini is listed as dead by the United States War Department. Louis Zamperini is alive and well as a prisoner of war here in Tokyo. This is one of the many examples of the men missing in action erroneously reported and later being established as a lie. Much suffering and heartaches could have been avoided by the transmittal of reliable information to the parties concerned regarding the whereabouts of men. So chin up, Mrs. Louise Zamperini. Louis is neither missing nor dead. Keep on listening, Mrs. Zamperini, and don't mention it. The pleasure is all ours. That's nice. So later, Moody wrote that when her colleague returned, I practically danced around the room telling her about it. 2 nights later, Moody was back on the night shift when a transcriber yelled to her. Moody ran in and put on the earphones. Hello, America, the announcer began. This is the postman calling and bringing a special message to Mrs. Louis Zamperini. Her son has come down to the studio especially to send her this message of reassurance after the erroneous report of a few days ago by the United States War Department that he was officially given up as dead and missing. A young man began speaking. Moody knew in an instant it was Louis. Hello, mother and father, relatives and friends. This is your Louis talking. Through the courtesy of the authorities here, I am broadcasting this personal message to you. This will be the first time in 2.5 years that you have heard my voice. I am uninjured and in good health and can hardly wait until the day we are together again. I am now interned in the Tokyo prisoners camp and being treated as well as can be expected under wartime conditions. The camp authorities are kind to me. Before I forget it, Dad, I would be very pleased if you would keep my guns in good condition so we might do some good hunting when I return home. Mother, Sylvia, and Virginia, I hope you will keep your wonderful talents in the kitchen. I often visualize those wonderful pies and cakes you make. Is Pete still able to pay you his weekly visits from San Diego? I hope he is still near home. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Your loving son, Louis. At the Zamperini house, a military telegram arrived, and on it were Louis's words. The telegram stressed that officials couldn't confirm Louis was really the speaker or a POW, but the Zamperinis focused on one sentence: keep my keep my guns and good. Going up shooting rabbits, Louis was fastidious about his guns. Zamperinis, this was the fingerprint, the detail only Louis would have thought to include. Luis and Sylvia began sobbing and shouting with joy. Pete picked up the phone, called a friend, and shouted 2 words: "He's alive." That's a very nice and happy moment. It's very nice. So that's the end of chapter